about time to begin. We'll get started here momentarily. Jamie, could you catch that door for me as you come in? And whoever's on the other side over there, maybe? I'm going to start a new series of classes tonight just to get us through the remainder of the summer. We're gearing up larger set of classes to get started in the not too distant future. Should be Labor Day. We'll be fully functional once school gets started. It's very difficult to plan anything new during the summer, because we don't know who's going to be here from week to week. So getting teachers is kind of a nightmare. So we're going to kind of limp along a little bit, but continue to have a class until September. And then we should have a variety of classes fully functional and available by the end of August is the idea. So we'll have that going. For now, though, I thought it would be a good time to study Christian worship for a couple of reasons. One, because I had some notes already on Christian worship, and I thought, hey, no reason to invent the wheel. But also because, as I mentioned last week, by way of announcement, coming out of our kind of post-COVID, nearly post-COVID era, we're having to think again about worship in fresh terms. One would be that we learned some things about worship while we were away. We did worship in ways we'd never done before, and that crisis caused us to give thought to new things. And then also, as we come back into the room and start getting back to whatever new normal is, you ask yourself, well, why did we do it this way? Was that a good idea? Why did we do it that way? Was it a good idea? And so it's helpful to kind of pick up every piece before you put it back and look at it and say, did that make sense? Did we do that for a reason? And we've been having a lot of those conversations. I mentioned last week talking about communion, just what's the best way to do communion. I asked for opinions. I think I got 300 different opinions. 300 contradictory opinions, so thanks for nothing. But no, we had some good input, and I think we put it in the hopper and turned it, and we'll see what comes out this morning and try to make some things available. But it's just a good time to think about, well, what are we trying to accomplish in worship anyway? Is the time to talk about it. My material that I'm going to be teaching for the next few weeks, perhaps. Can't advance a slide there, Alex or David or whoever happens to be there. You just get the title of today's lesson is all. There we go. It comes from a book I read a couple of years ago, authored by John Mark Hicks, Johnny Melton, and Bobby Valentine, called A Gathered People. And they come from a Church of Christ heritage and are looking at what does worship mean to us? What has it meant to us? And I think have a good take on it. Hicks in particular has done a lot of work on worship, on communion, and on baptism, and kind of what they mean in Scripture in our churches. So it was a good place for me to start. So if you want to go read something, good thing to go read. The first thing I'd point out is that when it comes to worship, we tend to fall into what in logic is called an either-or fallacy, which is where you say it's this or it's this and it's nothing in between, okay? So an example of the either-or fallacy is the advertisement I have on the screen, if you can see it. If you can't see it real well, I'll describe it to you. It's a little dated, but it's fun. On the one side is a guy's hand, and he's written notes all over his hand, okay? I was a handwriter in college, by the way. I don't know if you were or not, but in college, when it was due date assignment, the teacher would say, hey, this is due on Friday, and write it on my hand with my pen, which worked as long as I never washed my hands, right? And then I lost all my homework, and that was bad. So I was one of those people, chaos, written all over my hand. I took notes, but it was on my hand. And then the other device is a little older model Palm Pilot device. And what is the advertiser trying to tell you? Chaos or order. Either you buy our product or you live in a chaotic world of handwritten notes and scribbles and you'll forget everything. Okay? Well, that's great for advertising, right? Because that's what you're wanting to say when you advertise. You want to say, buy my product or the world will end, right? Buy my product or your life will be chaos. But in actual human life, that's not really the way it works. There's a whole lot of options in between buying their product or a chaotic world of writing all over your hand, okay? You can have a chaotic world of writing sticky notes, for example, somewhere in between, right? When I go into Miss Naomi's office, she likes little handwritten notes, and they're neat. I mean, they're well written and they're spaced out in kind of an order. And when I come in on Monday morning, she'll pick up her list and she'll just go by one. All right, this note was this and this note was this. Very orderly, doesn't use a Palm Pilot, doesn't write in her hand. Somehow we survive, right? My point, there's a lot of options, but if you're in advertising, you don't want people to think about options. Buy my product or you'll be lost in chaos. Okay, why do I make that point? In worship, a lot of times, we do the same thing. Either we do it like this or we do it like that, and there's nothing else. And we forget, there's door number 3, or lots of things in between. In Protestant churches, we typically viewed worship in one of 2 ways. The first, what we'll sometimes call high church, where we treat church worship as a formal assembly for glorifying God through sacrament and ritual. Okay? So if you visit a Lutheran church, you're going to have a lot of what's called high church. Methodists are going to have a fair bit of it, although they walk that line, they flirt with it. Outside of Protestantism, if you go to a Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church, those are all considered high church. Okay, so lots of ceremony, lots of ritual, emphasis on the sacraments, so communion is a big place in the worship, and everything's very formalized, right? Not very laid back, very formalized. Okay, the alternative in Protestant churches is low church, right? If you got high church, you got to have low church. And low church is an informal gathering of Christians to share their faith and be uplifted, okay? You're not going to have a lot of ritual, not going to have a lot of ceremony. In kind of the extreme case, you may not even know what's going to happen from week to week. It's a little more production-oriented, but not as much formally so. And the atmosphere is different than a high church. You're not going to have as much ritual. You might have communion, you might not. It's very, very different atmosphere in that kind of low church environment. In Churches of Christ, we also have kind of a dichotomy that we typically viewed worship in one of 2 ways. Either worship is glorifying God according to the New Testament pattern of worship through 5 prescribed acts, and you do those 5 things and you do them in the same order and you make sure you do it right. Or worship is building up one another in all of life through fellowship and service, and worship really doesn't matter. Like two very different opinions with, in my mind, a lot of ground in between. One says worship is everything and here's how to do it exactly. And the other says worship doesn't really matter, do it, don't do it. Just make sure you're living life the way you're supposed to. All your life is worship. And what I want to suggest to you today as our introductory lesson on worship is you don't have to pick between those 2 extremes. There's a lot of middle ground in between. In fact, biblical middle ground, where you say worship is important, but it may not be what you think it is every time. I want me to summarize those 2 views because you may have heard them before. This one comes from a book by a guy named Bannister from 1951. It's not important in terms of referencing that book, but this is something some guy in a Church of Christ wrote. Okay, he said, "To be scriptural, our Lord's Day worship must contain all of these 5 required items. The essential thing is that when we worship, we engage in all these scriptural acts. To have less than these 5, required 5 is to render the worship vain. To have more than these is to corrupt worship." Okay? So there you see pretty hard-nosed, like this is what worship is. There's exactly 5 things you have to do. If you do 4, it wasn't worship. If you do 6, it wasn't worship. 7's right out, okay? Just exactly 5, okay? We'll see if anybody has their Church of Christ membership card. Can anyone tell me the 5 acts? Okay. Prayer, I got one. Singing. Lord's Supper. Offering. Preaching. That's right, you better not forget preaching. Usually which one do people usually forget? Because we do communion and contribution at the same time, we tend to forget, that other one, yeah, we got to get your money. But those are the basic 5 that you'll hear discussed in some format. And to be fair, are all 5 of those things mentioned in the Bible? Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad list. That said, that guy was really emphatic, right? He said, there's 5 things. You do exactly 5 things. If you do 4 things, you're wrong. If you do 6 things, you're wrong. 5 things, okay? Now, in comparison, here's a book written 20 years ago. Can't believe that's 20 years ago. By Mike Root. He says, you won't find any place in the New Testament where these ideas of special presence or encounter with God are part of the Christian assembly. There's no more special presence of God on Sunday morning at the church building than there is in your car Monday morning. The idea of limited or special presence of God comes from temple traditions and cathedral thinking. What happens in the assembly of the saints is totally up to you. Okay? So the first guy was 5 things exactly, not 4, not 6. This guy says, in worship, nothing really happens. That's special in worship anyway. It's the same as driving in your car. You can do whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. It's up to you. Okay? So from as locked down as possible to as open-ended as possible. And they kind of go in fads, where like one will be popular. The one book was written in 1951, right? So at that era, like that was how you do it. And then the other book was written in 2000. 50 years later, kind of react against that and say, no, it's this way. It's completely the opposite. So what are the 2 views? Again, just to kind of summarize, the 5 acts model says there's a specific law for worship in the New Testament. There's exactly 5 acts. You do it only on Sunday, and you focus on God as primary. It's about up and down vertical. I'm worshiping God in my 5 acts, and that's all that I'm here to do. It doesn't have to be anybody else in the room, right? It's me and God doing this worship, okay? The edification model says, worship assemblies are not even the focus of the New Testament. Acts of worship concept is unbiblical anyway, and it takes place in all of your life, when you're mowing your lawn, when you're driving your car. Focus is horizontal. It's about edifying the person in the pew next to you, not so much the up and down. Okay, 2 extremes. Both of them have huge weaknesses that if you just picked one, you'd say, that's not quite right. Let's talk about the 5 acts model for just a second. The funny thing about the 5 acts model is that there's no verse in the Bible that says there are 5 acts, right? If you go looking for it, and let me tell you, Paul loves lists. If you read a couple of Pauline epistles, that dude loves a good list. He's going to list the fruit of the Spirit and the works of the flesh and the things like this and the things like that, and here's all the things. He loves lists. Nowhere gives us a 5-act list. The master of lists says, don't need to write down the 5 things. It would have been really convenient. Listen, if Paul gave us a list and said, here are the 5 things, I'd say, all right, I guess there's 5 things. He doesn't do that. So it's not an obvious New Testament doctrine. What you end up doing is cobbling together, well, here's one over here, and here's a thing over here, and here's a thing over here, and you put them together and say, that's our 5. The tendency of that way of thinking of worship is it tends to define faithfulness exclusively in terms of attendance. Like if worship is entirely about showing up on Sunday and doing 5 things, then either you did it or you didn't, right? Check. Are you a faithful Christian? Well, let's see. Did you do the 5 things this week? Did you do the 5 things last week? Did you do the 5 things before that? Okay, well then you're faithful. The end, right? And then it tends to minimize discipleship and service, because the big thing is to show up between, whatever the appointed hour is on Sunday morning and say, I did my thing, check, I'm done, and I have accomplished Christianity this week. Okay, so that's very dangerous to take it that way. On the other hand, the edification model is also lacking. Not all of life is the same as worship. I'm going to try to prove that to you today. There should be reverence and a worshipful spirit in all that you do, but there is a difference between taking communion and mowing your yard. They're not exactly the same thing. You can do both reverently. You can bring glory to God through both things, but they're not exactly the same thing. Okay? Something special does happen on Sunday morning. That's why we're here. We noticed that during the pandemic when we lost it. When we didn't have this, we lacked something. We could do everything else. We couldn't get together and do this, not in the way that we wanted. And it mattered because this is actually special. It actually does have substance and meaning. This model tends to be human-centered, where it's about building up the people around. The goal is to get everybody to leave in a good mood, right? Everybody have a good time when you're here. And that's nice. I'm not opposed to having a good time when you're here, but that does tend to leave out the person that the other model overemphasized, which was, well, the goal is to glorify God. If he wasn't here, it really doesn't matter who else was here. And then it erases the biblical and historical significance of Sunday. Christians are Sunday morning people, right? It matters. So you see, one view says everything a Christian does is on Sunday. And the other view says, well, Sunday doesn't matter. And I want to say, yeah, Sunday really does matter. It matters a great deal, and that's the reason we're here today. So, okay, let's talk about it then. Neither of these two views give a complete picture of worship as in Scripture. Why? Here's my case. Worship and service are inseparably connected, but not identical. Okay? They are definitely, deeply connected. They're not exactly the same thing. This is one, from time to time, I have flashbacks to sermons my dad preached when I was a kid, and I remember him making the comment, I think the church had a little sign at the back. Does our church have a sign at the back? The front? Anyway, a lot of churches have the sign in the back that says, enter to worship, exit to serve. You know, that's the kind of typical sign you see a lot of places. And Dad always complained about those signs. And he would say, there's supposed to be a little service in your worship and a little worship in your service. They're not the same thing, but they are deeply connected, right? There are ways that you can serve other people while we worship, and there are ways that you can be worshiping God when we're serving, but they're not exactly the same thing. And that's the case I want to try to make to you today. Look at the way Scriptures talk about it. This is from Hebrews 13, 15, and 16. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. And then verse 16, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Okay, so you have two sacrifice verses back to back. Almost any time you see the word sacrifice in the Bible, think worship, because Old Testament worship involved sacrifices. Okay, so the first type of sacrifice was literally what we would describe as what we do on worship. The fruit of our lips acknowledging his name. So maybe it's singing a song, a hymn, maybe it's saying a prayer, preaching a sermon, so forth, right? That's literally as close as you can get to here is what worship looks like, using your lips to glorify God. But then in the very next verse is a different kind of sacrifice. Don't neglect to do good and to share what you have. Is that one of our 5 acts of worship? No. I mean, not exactly. It could take the form we do give in worship, but it's not specifically a thing you do in worship. Listen to how generic that is. Do good. Boy, I hope you don't just do good on Sundays. I mean, we're in trouble. Okay. Share what you have. Is Sunday morning and during worship the only time you share what you have? Again, I hope not. In fact, probably the most of the doing good and sharing what you have takes place on a day other than Sunday morning. Okay? But those verses are back to back, and both use sacrifice language. Are they exactly the same? No, they're not exactly the same. Are they deeply connected? Yes, they are. That there are different ways that we sacrifice and reverence God. We worship with our lips, and then we do things with our actions. And both of those are reverent and sacrificial. They're not the same. They're both connected. Here's a passage that gets brought up a lot. Romans chapter 12, 1 through 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Well, is that verse about worship or service? And the answer is, maybe some of both, right? So it uses the word sacrifice, which is kind of worship language. But he tells you up front, I'm not exactly talking about worship in the normal sense. It's your body is a living sacrifice. Why does he have to say living sacrifice? Well, because usually the sacrifice is dead, right? I mean, that's how you sacrifice things. He says, well, here's an abnormal kind of sacrifice. He says it's your spiritual worship. Why doesn't he just say this is your worship? Well, it's not like normal worship, but kind of in a spiritual sense, it's worship. And then he gives you that verse about don't be conformed to the world. Is that only on Sunday morning, or is that throughout the rest of the week? Well, it's all of it. Like there's no part of your life that's supposed to be conformed to the world. So that would apply to worship, but it also can apply to everything else you do. And then just to really win it home, a couple of verses later, he starts listing things he's talking about because Paul loves a good list, but they're not acts of worship. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, well, that one might be worship. If service, in our serving. Well, is that one referencing service? Well, he used the word service, so I'm going to say yes. The one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. You could pick out a couple of those and say, well, that kind of sounds like Sunday morning. And then there's a couple others that you say, no, not quite, right? That it's more generalized. So I think what you're seeing in this passage is that worship and everyday life are deeply connected. They're not identical. And one relates to the other in an important way. So what is worship, and how do we define it, and how do we move forward? If I've given you two things and said it's not this or that, what is it? I think the best way to think of worship for Christians happens primarily when an assembled people come into the presence of God to glorify Him. Now, I have to put some disclaimers on that because it's a definition, and all definitions require disclaimers. Okay. So number one, notice I put happens primarily. That's my way of saying there are exceptions. One of the exceptions, I say an assembled people. Can you worship by yourself? Boy, I hope so. Does Paul worship by himself in a prison cell? Yeah. So I'm not suggesting that if you're, as Christ says, praying in your closet by yourself, that doesn't count. I'm just saying, primarily, when Christians talk about worship, what we mean is something we're going to come together, we're going to assemble together and do. That there's something that happens when we come together that's not the same as when we do it separately. So, for example, communion is a really good example of that. Okay? We're trying to figure out how best to do communion right now. And think about the things we're trying to juggle. Health policy, on the one hand, kind of it's fading a little bit, but it's kind of in the back of our minds. We just came out of a weird time. Okay, maybe don't want everybody to cough on me just yet. And then the idea of sharing. Communion is sharing. That's what the word means. So how do you share with sanitation? You don't, right? There's going to be some touching somebody else or involving somebody else in some way, no matter what you do. Now, I put some of the individual communion cups back out for people that felt like, I'm not quite comfortable with what we're doing, or if we might decide to pass a tray at some point, I don't know. If we do, okay, there's an option if you're feeling uncomfortable with that right now for pandemic reasons. We got the individual cups. But here's a question. Why don't we just send the individual cups home with you and say, take communion later? I mean, we did during the pandemic by necessity, but why don't we just do that all the time? Just say, take that cup home. Why do we say, take that cup and then come in here and take it? That's because that is the nature of communion, is to share with other people. That there is something meaningful that happens when you do that together rather than on your own. I don't know if I can put my finger on it and say this is the difference it makes, but it does make a difference. So worship happens primarily when an assembled people come into the presence of God to glorify Him. See how that definition has both aspects of what we've seen already. Does it involve other people and building each other up? Yes, it's something we do with other people. Does it involve glorifying God? Yes, not only glorifying God, it involves meeting God. We're going to go where God is and be where God is through the actions of worship. Not through geography, but through what we do. Let me give you some passages that speak of worship in this way. This is Deuteronomy chapter 12, 6 through 12. And there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices. Again, what did I tell you? You hear the word sacrifice, think worship, because that's what it meant in the Hebrew Scriptures. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice and take your households and all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite that is within your town, since he has no portion of inheritance with you. Okay? So notice, it's something you do, that words are highlighted, before the Lord your God. What does before the Lord your God mean? What? Sorry?
In the presence of God?
Yeah, something like in the presence of God, in the face of God, nearness to God. okay? That there was some sense, I mean, couldn't you make a sacrifice at home? Yeah, you could. But we want to come together and do it in the presence of God, okay? And notice who came. Does he say, you individually show up and give your worship and then go home? He says, no, bring everybody, right? Bring your family, bring your kids, bring your servants, bring some Levites, right? Make sure everybody's there. We're going to come together and then be in the presence of God together. And that's how worship is described in that special case. Here's another one, Deuteronomy 31, 10 through 13. And Moses commanded them at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release of the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God, at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, the sojourner within your towns. They may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God. And be careful to do all the words of his law, that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. The same sentiments there in the first couple of verses, right? I want everybody to show up. It's a big assembly in God's presence. Come together in the presence of God, okay, are the two elements that were typical in Old Testament worship. I'm going to say those same two elements are typical today. In the Old Testament, you accomplished it more by geography. You went to the right place. So think of the tabernacle at Bethel was like a phone booth, or maybe a place where you had good Wi-Fi, I don't know. You went somewhere, you got on the high hill, and you got closer to God there. When they built the temple, you went to the temple and you had good reception there. So you got a good signal and you brought your family and you were closer to God at the temple. So that was very, very much about location. What happens differently in the New Testament is that you accomplish all the same things without the emphasis on geography. That there's no passage in the New Testament that emphasizes and here's a place to go where you need to be so that you can worship on the map. Instead, when the New Testament uses temple language, it talks about Jesus, destroy this temple and I'll build it back in 3 days. And it talks about the church. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit who dwells within you, right? Wherever the church goes throughout all the world, wherever the church came together, became holy space. Not, again, the location on the map. It's because those people were there. If they met by the riverside, that was a place of worship. If they met in a building, that was a place of worship. They went to the synagogue, that was a place of worship. That wherever those people went, that was place enough. You had people, and God says, I'll meet you there. And those elements are what make worship in the Old Testament and the New. Let me look at Psalm 50 for a moment. If you want to know about worship, one good way to do it is to read songs used in worship. The Psalms are Israel's hymnal. And here's Psalm 50. Let me just do a couple of verses at a time. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to summon the creation to come and worship him. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes, he does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire, around him is a mighty tempest. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant and with me by sacrifice. Okay. So what's step one? He says, the whole earth owes glory and worship to God. So God says, let's gather them all up. Gather them all up so that I can meet them. And then God himself meets them when they come to meet God. Listen to verse 6 and 7. The heavens declare his righteousness as judge. Hear, O my people, and I will speak. O Israel, I will testify against you. I am God, your God. So see the story? Everybody gathered together, and then God says, okay, good, you're all here. Now let me speak to you. So where is God? He's with his people, right? Listen, I'm right here with you. I'm speaking to you. I am your God. Then he's going to talk about the fact that kind of gets overlooked. Why do we worship? Is it because God needs something from us? Listen to verses 8 through 13. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you. Your burnt offerings are continually before me. I will not accept a bull from your house or goats from your folds, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats? Does God need anything from you? Isn't it cute around Christmas time when your kids come to you and say, I'd like to give you a present. Can I have some money to go buy you a present? Right? And that's kind of what worship can look like if we get confused, because we say, God, look, I got you this. So let's say it's a cow. You know, we offer a cow on the sacrifice. Look at this cow. Who gave us the cow? God gave us the cow. And you say, well, that's different now. We don't do that. Yeah, we do. We go up and we give our contribution. God, I like you. Here's some money. Who gave you the money? It was never yours. John or Ronnie or somebody's going to lead us in singing. God, here's a beautiful song. Who gave us the song? Who gave us the voices? It's all his. Like, he doesn't need it. And for what it's worth, there's, I assume, an angel choir in heaven that's better than us anyway. Okay. So it's not like he's here. He's like, wow, if I don't show up on Sunday morning, God says, I just won't get anything. I'll be in trouble. No, God doesn't need anything from that. My favorite line in that, if I were hungry, I would not tell you. Right? Even if I were hungry, you're not the ones I'd ask, because you don't have anything to give me. You're puny. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you anyway. Okay, well then why are we here? Because worship is how we come into the presence of God, and that itself had meaning. Listen to 14 and 15. Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and perform your vows to the Most High God, and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Why do we do it? One, because God ought to be glorified. Why? Because he deserves it. And full stop. And it doesn't matter if you have anything to give, the giving matters. When my little kid says, Dad, can I have some money to buy you a present? I actually let him do that. Selena and I actually make a point of it that she'll take the boys shopping one time during Christmas and I'll take them shopping. Why? Not because we need what they bought us. I promise. We did not need what they bought us. But it was the act of giving to someone else that was important for them. Okay? So in worship, we are giving God what he deserves, even though we have nothing to offer. We give him what he deserves, and we have access to him. God says, when you glorify me, I am there with you, and I'm available to rescue you. Now, what do humans do? We really want to be in the presence of God when we're in trouble. We have no use for God when things are going well. God says, here's a novel idea. How about you say thank you first, and then when you need me, I'll be there. You give thanksgiving because I deserve it, and I'll of course be there when you're in need. So it has to do with access to God. In verses 16 through 21, he talks about the fact that there are things that can get in the way of good worship. But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you. If you see a thief, you are pleased with him, and you keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your brother. You slander your own mother's son. These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. What does God say? There is a connection between the rest of your life and worship. He says, if you're going to act like God either doesn't exist or that God is a sinner like you are, on Monday through Friday, by example, or in the Old Testament, so Sunday through Friday, if you're going to act like that the other 6 days of the week, don't show up on a day of worship and say, oh, God is really good and I really do what he says. Now, that's not the same as saying you have to live a sinless, perfect life in order to worship God. What he said was, some of you are just wicked It's not a matter of you sin. He says, you seem to like it, and you think I like it. He says, you can't worship me from that point of view. That's not possible. Why? Because life and worship are inseparably connected. And the psalm ends with, "Mark this then, you who forget God, lest I tear you apart and there be none to deliver. The one who offers thanksgiving as his sacrifice glorifies me. The one who orders his way rightly, I will show the salvation of God." Which things are essential? Offer thanksgiving, order your way rightly, right? Worship God, giving the glory he deserves. Try to live a life that matches that. Both of those things are expected by God, and they are deeply connected. Not exactly the same, but deeply connected. God is offended when we come into his presence to worship while ignoring him in daily life, because they are connected. Here's a passage from Amos. If you want to get a prophet to lose his mind, worship God one day and then act like you don't care the next. In fact, most of the minor prophets are on this topic, but here's just one. Amos 5:21-24. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. It's a good start, right? How does God feel about your worship? Let me think of words. I hate, I despise, I take zero joy in your worship. Oh, that's not good. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not even look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs, to the melody of your harps I will not listen. Well, what will you listen to? But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Righteousness and justice, as long as you're mistreating people during the week, don't offer me a sacrifice and think I'm going to care about it on the day of worship. That just can't be. In fact, not only is it not going to work, that'd be one thing. If it were a magic trick, and the magic trick of worship just didn't work because I didn't live right, well, then I just failed. God doesn't say it just doesn't work. He says, I hate it. That you are actually compounding your sinfulness and wickedness. It's one sin to do sinful things. It's another to then pretend that you could glorify God with those same sin-stained hands with no reverence whatsoever, as if God didn't matter. He says, this is a second sin, and if anything, I hate it more. Let me read a little bit from Amos chapter 8. Couldn't get it all on the screen, so I'll just read a bit. Verse 3, "The songs of the temple shall become wailings in that day, declares the Lord. So many dead bodies, they are thrown around everywhere. Silence." That's a great verse, right? He says, you're going to come to worship one day, and instead of a beautiful hymn, you're going to hear a funeral song and see dead bodies. Amos is a little upset, and God is terrifying. Why is that? Verse 4-6. "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over and we can sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may take the ephah small and the shekel great and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and sell the chaff of the wheat." He says, you're crooked businessmen. He says, you got dishonest weights. You know what that means, by the way? So think about, you got your scale, right? And everything you buy, grain or whatever, is scale-based, weight-based. And so you got one set of weights. And when you're buying, you use this set of weights. When you're selling, you use the other set of weights. You get a little extra when you buy, you give them a little less when you sell. God says, I hate it. I hate it. And no amount of worshiping makes dishonest business okay. In fact, your worship is like nails on a chalkboard. It offends God. So verse 7-10, "The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile and be tossed about and sink again like the Nile of Egypt? On that day, declares the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the sky in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentations. I'll bring the sackcloth on every waist and baldness on every head. I'll make it like the morning for an only sun, and the end of it like a bitter day. So imagine the worst day you've ever had. That's what I'm going to bring to you if you don't stop trivializing my worship. So you see the connection there? He's not saying worship doesn't matter. Quite the opposite. Worship matters a ton. He's not saying only worship matters, as if the rest of your life was irrelevant. He says they're deeply connected. Don't bring me one without the other. Connect those things. Another passage that emphasizes this is Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted. This is speaking to God. But you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. The psalmist says, I finally figured out what you want, God. You gave me a body, and you want me to use it to do your will. When? On any day you have a body. Fair enough. If you ever find yourself disembodied, you don't have to serve God that day. But any day you've got a body that God gave you to serve Him, He says, that's when you should be serving me. And He says, until you do, sacrifice and offering aren't going to matter much. So does that mean worship doesn't matter? I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips. As you know, O Lord, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. I served God, and so I had reason to be grateful to God and all that He did in my life. And so I got together, I gathered the whole church, Old Testament church, right? The whole congregation of Israel. He said, I got them all together, and we talked and talked and talked about how great God is, because we had seen it in our lives, because we had used our bodies to do His will. So conclusions as we wrap up. What do we learn about worship this week? Main point was this. First of all, not all life is worship, but all of life is connected to our worship. And I say that because I know people that will take it to mean like, I don't really need to be there on Sunday. It has no significance. I'm a pretty good guy the rest of the week. Something special does happen on Sunday, and I want to spend the next couple of weeks trying to convince you of that. That said, being here on Sunday isn't a box that you check and then say, now I can do whatever I want. It's not one or the other. They're deeply connected. Worship assemblies are special encounters with God, but they are not substitutes for a life of service before God. Okay? They are deeply connected. There's worship in our service and service in our worship. Neither good service nor good worship make you faithful by themselves. Well, I'm not much of a servant, but I worship really good. I don't worship much, but I serve pretty good. Those things are supposed to be going together. In fact, neither worship nor service is even possible alone. And the example God gives frequently is, if you're worshiping me and not serving, I didn't hear that. Right? You're not going to be able to do one without the other. Not even possible. Service makes you a better worshiper, and worship makes you a better servant. One fills in the other. So the next couple of weeks, going to spend on worship and talk about, okay, so we've talked about the difference and how they're connected. What is worship and how do we go about it? What makes it valuable? What makes it meaningful? And how do we encounter God in our worship? What should we be looking for in worship? What's the goal? Thanks for your time and attention, and we'll have worship in about 15 minutes.